Good morning. I'd like to call the special board meeting March 8th, 2021 to order. Roll call, please.
Mr. Hess. Present. Mr. Tholen. Mrs. Pope.
Present.
Mr. Snipes.
Present.
Mr. Seroy.
Present.
Mr. Lear. Present. Mrs. Weber.
Present.
Mrs. Peters.
Present.
Mr. Payton.
Present.
Mrs. Parker.
Present.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Present.
Mr. Fairfield.
Present.
Mr. Carrico.
Present.
Mr. Eckhoff.
Present.
Mr. Smith from Salina.
Present.
Mr. Swanson.
Present.
Mr. Featherling.
Present.
Mr. Dunhill.
Present.
Mr. Miller.
Present.
Mr. Long. Mr. Long. Mr. Kirkstra.
Present.
Mr. Hunter.
Here.
Ms. Bryan.
Present.
Mr. Collins.
Present.
Ms. Hudson.
Present.
Mr. Smith from Bourbonnais.
Present.
Mr. Wheeler. Have a quorum.
Thank you. I have received no public comment. Is there any public comment? Any public comment? Seeing none. Thank you. And the purpose of this meeting today is that the appointments, the precedented appointments of county board has come into question. We at the county board want to be transparent and want to operate with the guidelines and guidance of our state's attorney's office. And with that, I will yield the floor to Mr. Rowe.
So I want everyone to be assured that the interest here is in doing this process correctly and doing it right every time. When we look over the history, decades in fact, of appointments that have come before the county board, they've been done in many different manners. Sometimes a vacancy was announced orally, a vote was taken on the appointment. There were a couple occasions, I believe it might have been under Chairman Wenzelman, if I'm not correct, once or twice where the board voted on a vacancy through resolution, and then they voted on the replacement. But historically, the county has had where the chairman would announce the vacancy, and then on advice and consent of the board, they would vote on it and approve it. When we look at what other counties do, because when you look at the county code, the state statutes portion of the county code, I don't want to take it down because we're closed, sorry. When you look at that state statute, it says that the board shall declare the vacancy. Now, when you think about that for a minute, imagine what kind of complications that could potentially cause. Let's just say, for instance, you had a 28-member board, and there were 14 from Party A and 14 from Party B, and a vacancy occurred. The majority remaining on that board, the 14 to 13, could then say, well, we're not going to declare the vacancy. And then for the remainder of that term, could be as many as just under 28 months. Party B could really run the board. Or you could have a situation, I suppose, on the flip side of that, if a chairman was, if that sole responsibility was delegated to a chairman could say, I'm not going to declare the vacancy. And that leaves an entire district of citizens without a vote, without a voice, through a vote on the county board. So there's concerns with how state statute reads. But ultimately, it's important that we comply with state statute every time to the fullest extent of the law. And an issue was raised a couple meetings ago and then in an email by Member Snipes about who declares the vacancy. So I looked at, see what do other counties do all across Illinois. Some of them don't necessarily matter in the analysis because they may have a county executive form of government or a county chairman who's been elected countywide. But for the majority of counties in Illinois, the county chairman is selected by the county board, much like our form of government here. So when you look across those counties, And just who declares the vacancy? Is it by vote of the board? Is it by public announcement? When you start to run through that list, I can tell you the supermajority of those counties that are organized like ours have a process where the chairman announces the vacancy orally, and then later, with the advice and consent of the county board, they vote on the appointment of a person to fill the vacancy. Some counties declare the vacancy by vote. Mason County, Ogle, Edgar, Kane, Cumberland, Winnebago, they have a resolution where they declare a vacancy by vote of the board. Jefferson County, Whiteside County, Kendall County, Boone County, Marshall County, Shelby County, Champaign County, Wayne County, Cass County, Lake County, White, Winnebago, Stark. So many counties don't do that. They announce it orally. And then the board votes ultimately on the appointment, but never to vote to declare the vacancy, like Kankakee County has done, again, for decades. When you look back historically on the board, Duda, Featherling, Hunter, Kirkstra, Dunnell, Miller, Haas, Kinzinger, Kalecki, Wilson, Witten, Taylor, Siroy, Miller, and those are probably just within recent history. Those were all done where a vacancy was announced and later voted on. But just because it's always been done that way doesn't mean we always keep doing it that way.
So a precedent doesn't matter?
Past precedent doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me, and I don't believe it would matter in a legal analysis if something ever did come before a court, right? Because let's just say, for instance, if we did something wrong, if something was done wrong, just the fact you've done it wrong 100 times doesn't mean that the next time you can continue doing it wrong. Now, to sit up here and say that all those decades, all those appointments over the years were done wrong, I can't say that, right? That would be something a court would have to resolve. And interestingly, this matter has never been adjudicated in front of a court, this statute on declaring a vacancy. Never once has anyone ever opined on it beyond an attorney general opinion from back in 1975. And that was simply, it wasn't on the declaration of a vacancy, it was on appointing within that 60-day period from when the vacancy exists. And another concern we had is, well, what if a board were to simply kick that bucket down the road, right? Kick that can down the road and never make that appointment within 60 days? You'd have the same tragic outcome. You'd have a whole district of people who have no voice on the county board. And what the Attorney General's opinion says, in fact, the statute says, with advice and consent of the county board shall, within 60 days of the date of the vacancy occurs, appoint some person. What they found was that the outcome, if they didn't, again, no representation. That can't possibly be the outcome if you followed state statute. So the Attorney General concluded, it says, in conclusion, it's my opinion that while the officer of the board with advice and consent has the mandatory duty to fill a vacancy on said board by appointment, the requirement that that appointment be made within 60 days of the date the vacancy occurs is directory only. The alternative to directory is mandatory. You're saying it's not mandatory, it's directory. Consequently, and again, I'm quoting right from the opinion, an otherwise valid appointment made after the 60-day period has passed is valid. So the 60-day thing, it's directory, not mandatory. It's probably ideal that it always be done within that 60-day period. Otherwise, you run into a meeting or two where that district has gone without a voice on the board, potentially on some important votes. But it is not a bar to a later appointment. That's the only legal opinion that we can find even relating to this process. But if we're gonna do it in such a way where we know it's always done right, where I would feel comfortable going into court and defending the county board's actions, I think going forward, we do a resolution declaring a vacancy and we put even the appointment in writing by way of a resolution. So nothing's done orally. There's some counties on that list I read you. One of them, they do not announce it orally, but they publish it on their social media page. I couldn't defend that in court. In some of them, they have the media reported the vacancy. So while everyone else is all over the map, I want to err on the side of caution. So for the District 16 vacancy, it just seems right that we would have a resolution declaring a vacancy, and that same resolution confirming the appointment by advice and consent of the board. If we're going to do that correct on that one going forward, then I have to look and say, are there any other members of the county board who we haven't followed that process for that are serving by appointment? And there's only one, District 26. I'm not comfortable just leaving that one kind of hanging out there, where this board, anytime they have a vote, do you really want to look in the rearview mirror and wonder? The right thing to do here is to clean it up. This is not saying something was done wrong. This is not saying that there's a violation or anything is illegitimate. This is saying that we're dotting our I's, we're crossing our T's, we're making sure that everything is done perfectly correct. I hope that, you know, last time this issue came up, there was a lot of discussion. A lot of it was last minute. While the discussions were going on, there were legal questions raised. I've had a conversation with Mr. Snipes, because I do appreciate you, Robert, bringing this stuff to our attention, especially that email you sent. You cited some additional authority in there, and I appreciate you doing that. And that's what's pushing us to clarify this process going forward. At the April meeting, I hope to bring to you a proposed, or well, to the executive committee, it will go first, but some proposed language to amend our county code of ordinances to really lay out this process. So it's in writing every time we set out the dates, and as best as the county board can do in the future, meet those 3-day notice deadlines, 60-day appointment deadlines. Although they are, again, directory, not mandatory. So I hope we can just contain this kind of to the process and cleaning up the process. Yes.
Mr. Hunter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Why wouldn't you codify it? Wouldn't that be codifying it in terms of procedure that you're proposing for the executive committee and then for us to vote on it?
That is what I'm gonna do at the executive committee and then the April meeting, hopefully, or May at latest,
Okay.
to make sure that it's in our county code of ordinances, just so it's a clear process. Because really, the way you look at it now, I hope you can see how someone could take the language of that state statute and really play with it in such a way that leaves 1/28 of all your residents without any voice in county government, and that would be horrible. And yeah, that's something we're trying to avoid.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Rowe?
Peters, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Peters?
Yes, Mr. Rowe. So at our last meeting, when we voted on this thing where all the questions came up, we were told that we had to fill the seat at 60 days. So what you're saying is we don't have to fill it. It's not mandatory. They just direct us that it would be best practices to do that, correct?
That's correct. It's mandatory, according to this Attorney General opinion, which was based on validity of appointment to fill a vacancy on the county board made after a 60-day period for filing said vacancy has passed. So it's that exact issue. According to this AG opinion by AG Scott, it is mandatory that they fill the vacancy. The 60 days is directory only. So should it be filled within 60 days? Absolutely, every time. If for some reason that 60-day requirement is not met, that would not prohibit the board from still appointing someone so long as they follow the valid process. So it should always be filled within 60 days, but if it's not for some reason, it can be done after.
Mr. Snipes?
Yes, thank you, Jim, and thank you for researching that information. Sometimes we come to the meetings of the minds when we are at odds. But in this case, we do have a state's attorney, and we also have the Attorney General's office, and then even the courts if we have to. I did have a quote warrant to action on, it's on my desk now, which now I don't have to basically mitigate in the court to bring it, because we're now going into a process that we're going to kind of follow the law as far as declaration is concerned. Sometimes we are in the minority when we are doing such, but just rest assured that it's important that every board member here is heard. Those individuals that were of like mind, and then Ms. Peters, who had to step across the aisle and probably got some unnecessary comments. You know, again, we applaud those individuals that will look at a situation, that will call, that will ask questions like she did and others, to kind of get some clarity. But in the process, we come to a resolution where as we're now correcting, and that's the overall objective or overall intent of the process, is to make sure that we are in accordance with law. And so I applaud your efforts, and also your constant communication. A lot of times we agree, disagree, we'll look at the different perspectives, and then but one of the things I do applaud you on is you want to always do the right thing, so thank you.
And I want to thank you, because anytime you and I have had a difference of opinion, you've always kept it about the subject, not the person. So
Right.
I appreciate that from you.
Thank you. Mr. Hess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Mr. Rowe. Jim, when does the time clock start then? When somebody resigns from the board, or when the vote is taken?
So if you go right to that section of the state statute, that's 10 ILCS 5/25-11. It says when a vacancy occurs in a, let's say, a county board office, the board shall declare that the vacancy exists, and notice shall be given within 3 days to the 3 established parties. In our county, we have 3 established political parties. Well, the challenge with that is that in these instances, at least, I believe for the one member Zuccolo, her vacancy existed on December 18th when she moved out of the county, and she didn't notify the county board until the 30th. So you were 12 days later. And that's sort of that's a challenge in these situations, because a vacancy exists by matter of law. The board declaring the vacancy, really, whether they declare it or not, there is a vacancy. When someone moves, if someone were to die, that vacancy absolutely exists whether the board declares it or not. So that it's just an issue with state statute. My advice, and what I'm going to propose to the board, is that when a vacancy occurs by death or by resignation, that the county chairman would send out that notice within 3 days to the 3 political parties. And then if there's a need for a special board meeting, the board can always call one. But otherwise, at the next board meeting, the county board would declare the vacancy. But that 60 days really starts from the occurrence of the vacancy. And this language, what it says is, the notice shall be given to the county central committee of each established political party within 3 days of the occurrence of the vacancy. So that's before the board even declares the vacancy. It's confusing, it's odd how they word it.
That's why I asked the question. I just want to make sure we know what the time frame is, even though we don't have to go the 60 days.
Yeah. So, but the vacancy should be filled
Declared.
within 60 days of the occurrence of the vacancy. The notice should be sent within 3 days of the occurrence of the vacancy, but there's no time frame from the declaration of the vacancy and the appointment. Yeah, the 60 days is really from the date of the occurrence of it until you fill it.
Thank you.
Yep. And I don't want the board to think that it's okay to go beyond the 60 days, that 60 days really isn't relevant. It's completely relevant. It's so important, because you don't want people without a voice. But if for some reason you can't fill it within that 60-day period, you just, as long as you do it legally, you're still okay.
Any other questions?
Yes, Peters, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Ms. Peters for a second time, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, how are the appointees chosen? Are they chosen by the board chair or the political party that was notified? And then were there any other candidates for these positions?
That's not something I can speak to. That's the stuff that is, that's part of the political process that the state statute affords. I don't know what that process looks like. I know that, you know, they're appointed with the advice and consent of the county board. But how those individuals are chosen, that's something, you know, I can tell you that if someone is if the vacancy occurs and the individual who was in that position was a Republican, it has to be filled by someone who's a registered Republican. Same thing if it was a Democrat. Whether that's done by a chairman, whether that's done by the respective political party, those are not matters really before the county board. Your portion of this is to vote on the appointment, where you provide your advice and consent or not.
Any other questions for second time? Mr. Hunter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Give you a scenario, Mr. Rowe, and I think we just went through this recently with the holidays. President's Day, Lincoln's, whatever, Washington, whatever. There was a holiday on a Friday and there was a holiday on a Monday, right?
Correct.
County Board A passes Thursday night, okay? The county chairman is on vacation in Kathmandu, okay? Now that needs to be clarified as well too, because you're saying that the county board chairman shall, which is binding, I'm not sure if it's may. Would that mean that the vice chairman would have to make that designation or what?
Sure, in the absence of the chairman, the vice chairman could do that.
Right.
But again, those holiday dates falling, which would extend it beyond 3 days.
That's right.
That's exactly why it should be directory, not mandatory.
That's right. That's right. Because, you know, that could have been a scenario. I mean, you know, just recently. So I just wanted to make sure, because you think in terms of that person dies Thursday night, that's Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday's a holiday as well too. In the absence of the chairman, you know, vice chairman would have to make that designation.
Yep.
So, yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Anyone on Zoom? I'd like to thank Mr. Rowe for his opinion. I think that makes a ton of sense, and that is the right thing to do going forward. And we're establishing a precedent now that we'll have for forever. So I appreciate Mr. Rowe's opinion, and thank you for clarifying that. So moving on, can I get the first resolution read into the record?
Title or the whole thing?
Let's read the whole thing. It's not read. Thank you.
You just need to read the title into the record.
Title?
Yeah.
Okay.
Resolution of the County Board of Kankakee County, Illinois, declaring vacancy in County Board District 16 and approving the appointment of Matthew Alexander Hildebrand to the Kankakee County Board District 16 vacancy.
Can I get a motion? Mrs. Parker and Mr. Eckhoff with a second. Is there any discussion?
Swanson.
Thank you. We've got a second. Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Any discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mrs. Pope.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Aye.
Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Carrico. Mr. Eckhoff.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Salina.
Aye.
Mr. Swanson.
I'm not on the panel.
Aye.
Five.
Mr. Featherling.
Aye.
Mr. Dunhill.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Kirkstra.
Aye.
Mr. Hunter.
Aye.
Ms. Bryan. Ms. Bryan. Mr. Collins.
Aye.
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 Ms. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Bourbonnais.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Did you get Brian? Did you record?
Yes,
her vote?
yes.
She did.
Okay, could I get Mr. Alexander Hildebrand to come forward, please? Yeah. Is there a mic back? You want to do it on the back mic?
Yeah, let's do it back there.
Do it on that back microphone.
I, Matthew Alexander Hildebrand, having been appointed to the office of County Board Member, District 16, in the County of Kankakee, and State of Illinois, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Illinois, and will faithfully discharge the duties of the office of County Board Member, District 16, to the best of my ability. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, perfect.
Matthew, come on up. Matthew, come on up and fill a vacant seat. I think there's one open. Your nameplate will be on the open one. Oh, right here. You're in right there, sir. Welcome aboard.
Thank you very much.
Next resolution, please, Mr. Henderson.
Resolution of the County Board of Kankakee County, Illinois, declaring vacancy in County Board District 26 and approving the appointment of Andrew Wheeler to the Kankakee County Board District 26 vacancy.
Need a motion? Mr. Lear? Anybody from Zoom?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Which Smith?
Mr. Ken Smith.
Okay, thank you.
And any discussion? Mr. Snipes?
The discussion is not so much of the appointment. The discussion is just for clarification of information. Because we have went through this process, the payments and stuff that went out, we're not going, that will be negated if not challenged at any particular point, because we paid out money out of the county funds. So I don't have the public coming back, whether because we're going through the process here, the procedures is to put this in a particular place or whatever, and if there was any dollars spent, it would be just kind of, we're correcting the procedure, correct?
This is just cleanup.
Cleanup,
Say.
all right.
Yeah, this is just to make sure that for record, right, for the purposes of the record,
Right,
that everything is clear.
okay, that's good enough.
Any other questions? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mrs. Polk.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes. Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear. Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Aye.
Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Carrico. Mr. Eckhoff.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Salina.
Aye.
Mr. Swanson. Mr. Swanson. Mr. Featherling.
Aye. Swanson, aye. Featherling, aye.
Mr. Dunhill.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Kirkstra.
Aye.
Mr. Hunter. Ms. Bryan.
Aye.
Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Ms. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Bourbonnais.
Aye.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Motion carries.
And then the next item, just briefly, that again is just cleanup. Since we've done the reappointment, that process should be done as well. Did you call Mr. Alexander?
I did.
So we're gonna move on to election of the county board chairman. Do I have a motion to nominate the chairman for the Kankakee County Board? Mr. Hess?
So moved, Featherling.
Hold on a second, John.
I make a motion that we elect Andrew Wheeler as chairman of the county board.
Mr. Hunter,
And I will second it, Your Honor.
second motion. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Motion to close nominations? Mr. Featherling?
So moved.
Okay, thank you. Second to close nominations?
Smith.
Mr. Payton, thank you. Roll call vote to close nominations.
Mr. Hess. Mrs. Polk.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes. Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear. Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Aye.
Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Carrico. Mr. Eckhoff.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Salina.
Aye.
Mr. Swanson.
Aye.
Mr. Featherling.
Aye.
Mr. Dunhill.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Kirkstra.
Aye.
Mr. Hunter. Ms. Bryan.
Aye.
Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Ms. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Bourbonnais.
Aye.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Roll call vote to elect Andrew Wheeler chairman.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mrs. Polk.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear. Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Aye.
Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Carrico. Mr. Eckhoff.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Salina.
Aye.
Mr. Swanson.
Aye.
Mr. Featherling.
Aye.
Mr. Dunhill. Mr. Dunhill.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Kirkstra.
Aye.
Mr. Hunter. Ms. Bryan.
Aye.
Mr. Collins.
Aye.
Ms. Hudson.
Aye.
Mr. Smith from Bourbonnais.
Aye.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Mr. Snipes?
Just so a point of clarification, I know we did the swearing in prior. Does that swearing in come forward, or do we just for the purpose do the swearing in because we did and do and act the resolution declaring? So I don't want anything coming up as a legality
He
saying
was always sworn, but I can have
just do another swearing in just for the
Swear him in
purpose
after the
Swear
meeting.
him in.
because of the thing.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, we'll swear him in.
I got his oath ready to go.
I just want
I
to.
want to do that before we did the election.
I want to thank the board for being understanding of this process. I know it's been a hassle. I know there were a lot of, emotions involved in this from the start. And thank you so much for putting, the politics and everything else aside so that we can correct this and help it go forward. I'm really thankful to all of you for working together on it.
Thanks, Jim.
Mr. Hess?
Thank you, Chairman. Jim, I want to thank you for all your hard work and that. This is why we have a state's attorney and our representative for the county board, just for purposes like this. And while I'm talking, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Can I get a second?
You stole that one.
Second.
Mrs. Polk seconded. All in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Have a good day, everybody. See